So you're good for the... Okay, so the first speaker we have today is going to be Linda Montgomery, who was the former Arizona Talking Book Library director. And so when I got my start in 2010, Linda was the director of the library. And I would consider her, the best role model. What I really respected about Linda was, certainly she was off doing important business to help run the library. But in addition to that, she was always willing to pitch in and help out on the phone. So you'd hear her in the office talking to someone and finding out, what kind of books they want to read and all that good stuff. So she was definitely a director, was with the boots on the ground, but also finding ways to, make inroads and find new ways of serving the people that we are, wanting to reach out to statewide to offer our services to. So I will go ahead and do a formal introduction. I just kind of wanted to share that because I'm really happy that she's able to join us today and that we are able to, we took her back from Texas where she spent a little bit of time. And then thank you so much for joining us today, Linda. So Linda Montgomery began her library career at the Daly City Public Library in California and Children's Services from 1975 to 1977. She worked at the South Caroliniana Library at the University of South Carolina from 1978 to 1984, where she also received her Master of Library Science degree. In 1985, she joined the staff of the Arizona State Braille and Talking Book Library, where she served first as Special Services Librarian, then as Assistant Director, and in 1993 was appointed Director. She retired July 2015 and moved to South Texas, but in 2023 returned to Arizona. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome Linda here to tell you a little bit more about kind of what has happened over the years. So thank you, Linda. Green light is good.
And now you should be able to hear me, I hope. Well, I'm really pleased that Erin asked me to come back and talk about the history of the library service for Arizona. And I'm going to start with just a little background on the National Library Service itself. National Library Service actually was started by an act of Congress to provide Braille books to individuals in the United States. But then very quickly, 1934, they actually amended that act to add audiobooks for circulation. Now, back in those early days, they first recorded the books on 78 RPM records. Anybody here who remembers using 78s? A few of you. Okay. But it was actually the National Library Service that developed the 33 1/3 RPM record because they could get more words on a record at that speed than they could at 78. And then, of course, I'm sure you all know 33 1/3 became the commercial standard. Well, NLS was always trying to conserve on materials and cost. So later they actually started producing records on these little flexible discs, which were very inexpensive to produce. And they actually slowed those all the way down to 8 RPMs. It worked fine for spoken word. You couldn't do that with music, of course. It was too slow. But the service was always free and available to anyone, anywhere in the United States or any U.S. territory. And for anyone who was not only blind, visually impaired, but also may have had a physical impairment that made it hard to handle and use a print book. Now, the next big change came in the 1960s, and that was when the change came to books on cassettes. And if any of you here were here earlier, you may have heard some of this, but NLS first recorded 2 tracks, and then they decided that, again, to conserve on materials and save money, they put 4 tracks on every cassette. And they even recorded at half of commercial speed, which made it possible to get more on a cassette, but also made it impossible for the general public to use those. They could only be played on the National Library Service equipment. Now, before Arizona had its own regional libraries, patrons received Braille service from the Braille Institute in California, and their recorded service from NLS in Washington, D.C. But then in 1970, Arizona finally got its own regional library, and Arlene Bonsall was the first director of the library here, and it was initially located across the street in one of the part of the building that was developed by the Arizona Lions Foundation. They developed the complex for individuals who are blind and visually impaired, and over the years, lots of services for that part of our community. Then a little while later, they decided that Arizona needed its own library, and so it was the Lions Foundation of Arizona, who, through an agreement with the state of Arizona, had this building constructed to be the Braille and Talking Book Library Service for the state. I started here in 1985, and I spent 31 years here at this library, and it was the best part of my life. It's such a wonderful service, and I just absolutely loved what I did. I loved the people I worked with and the people we served. So what my first task was as special services librarian when I was hired, I was the person who was to oversee outreach and the volunteer program, including the recording studio. And my very first task was to develop a manual for the volunteers for doing the recording using the new Tascam reel-to-reel recorders. But not only that, I was also tasked with putting together instructions for actually following the very strict NLS recording standards, because Richard Peel, who was director then, wanted us to be involved in what was called the Quality Assurance Program, whereby if our recorded books done here locally actually met all of NLS's standards, which were extremely strict, NLS would put our book into the national collection. Well, we actually got the very first book accepted. It was a children's book called The Desert Is Theirs. And the volunteer who recorded it, I think recorded it at least 3 times before it got accepted. But we got RCN1. And then one of our volunteers actually got RCN2. And that was Tiger in Darkness, a Harlequin romance. Now, in our studios here, we would record mostly books about Arizona and the Southwest, but we would also record pretty much any book that a patron asked for. We recorded magazines, and we had a volunteer who actually described all the photographs in Arizona highways for that one, which was very different. But one of the projects that I remember was, for many years, we actually recorded TV Guide every week. And yes, every once in a while when the volunteer couldn't be here, guess who was in the studio recording TV Guide? Well, we had a very, very active volunteer program here, and we actually, in the 1990s, we had volunteers donating over 30,000 hours to our library here. They helped with outreach, the recording, they repaired cassettes. The little tapes inside those cassettes would get tangled. We had volunteers who would open them up, straighten the tape out, and fix them. We had a large machine repair program. And then when the digital players came, after the cassette players, unfortunately we had a lot of machine repair volunteers who thought they really didn't want to continue because there wasn't as much repair work to do. But we talked quite a few of them into staying. Now in 1993 is when Richard Peel retired and I was appointed as director. Oh, but there was one other special volunteer that I wanted to tell you about, and that was Walter. One of the more interesting facts about Walter is, as a very young man, he was an apprentice under Thomas Edison. He actually developed a process for repairing the old hard disk records. Here in the Arizona heat especially, they would get warped. He'd heat them up in the oven, press them flat between some masonite, and then using dental tools and some tools that he developed, he actually repaired the grooves in the records so they could still be used. Now, I remember the day that Walter turned 90, and we actually had a birthday cake for him with 90 candles. I'm amazed we didn't set off the smoke alarms. Well, in 1999, I worked with Harriet McIntosh to develop a friends group for the library, and those of you who were here earlier heard from Frank, who happens to be one of the members of our Arizona Friends of Talking Books. Their first project was to raise $5,000 to purchase some audio-described movies on VHS. These are movies that in between the dialogue, a narrator describes what's going on. He describes the action, might describe the scenery, might even describe facial expressions or what the actors were wearing. These became very popular. The next thing that happened was in 2006 for the Friends to help us change our recording studio from reel-to-reel recording to digital recording. So the Friends were the ones who actually purchased the computers to make that conversion for us. In 2009, it took a while for NLS to get the digital player out. Initially, we were still putting the digital recordings onto cassettes for quite a while. But in 2009, the very first digital players were issued by NLS. And we had a program down at the Capitol, and our Arizona veterans were the ones to receive the very first digital players here. In 2013, NLS finally made BARD, the Braille and Audio Reading Download service. And that was a really exciting change, especially for many of our tech-savvy patrons who could now download their audiobooks to their iPhone or their iPad. They were so excited they could actually do this themselves, and they could keep them for as long as they wanted. So they would develop these libraries in their phones. Now, the machine services staff had the biggest change over, and the duplication area, where we of course had to buy new equipment, replace all the cassette duplicators with digital duplicators. In 2015 was when the regional libraries were finally allowed to post our books on BARD. And that was a really wonderful change because it made so many more books available. Many of the regional libraries throughout the United States have recording programs. Today, there was another change that came after Aaron became our director here. And that was to do multiple books on digital cartridges on demand. So that was another wonderful change. Now, when I retired in 2015, Janet Fisher became the next director here at the library, director number 4. And then in 2022 is when she decided to retire, and I was so pleased that Aaron was selected to be your new administrator. Now, the most recent developments from NLS that I am aware of is a portable digital Braille reader that has refreshable Braille display. But as Kevin was talking, I was extremely excited to hear that the new digital player that's coming out, patrons will actually be able to access BARD and download digital books directly to the player. And he tells me that maybe eventually the reader advisors will be able to push books out to the patrons player, which was something back before I retired that we kind of dreamed of happening. Well, I enjoyed the service here, and I'm so glad to see you here, and please continue to take advantage of the machine section where there is information about those wonderful new developments, and to please be sure and visit the booths downstairs as well. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Linda. Yeah, when you were talking, I had a kind of a flashback, because when I started in 2010, Linda was mentioning 2009 was about when we started receiving those first digital players. And, I was kind of learning the ropes and everything, and we had the software that we used to find books and assign them to patrons to mail out. And at that time, people had both the cassette player and were starting to receive those digital players. But there were so few digital books available that what would happen is the software would kind of get stuck looking and looking and looking for those few books and eventually crash for me. And so, now that we have well over, I think 160,000 books to be able to choose from, things go a lot more smoothly for us, for the librarians. So thank you again, Linda, for kind of offering us that tour of what has happened with the Talking Book Library program over the years. So now our next presenter, very happy to welcome Andrea Pasquale, who is a person here that is wearing many hats with us today. She's first and foremost in her day job as Sun Sounds of Arizona, the director there. And Sun Sounds is a big partner of ours. They're the radio reading service for the state. She has worked of Sun Sounds of Arizona since 2007. She started as manager of programming and volunteers and has been the director since 2014. In addition, she's been a board member of Arizona Friends of Talking Books, which is the nonprofit organization that supports our library, since 2012. Previously, she was a part of Chris Radio, the reading service in Connecticut from 2001 to 2007. So a lot of good experience with those radio reading services. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and have Andrea join us and tell us a little bit more about her hats. So thank you.
The funny thing is, when I started at Chris Radio, I actually wanted to get out of the radio business. I was doing commercial radio, and I said, I've had enough of this. And I ended up staying in radio, just in a different form. Well, I'm very happy to be working with the Arizona Talking Book Library, because they have always been working very well with their community, and they formed some great partnerships. Now again, one of those partnerships is with Sun Sounds of Arizona. And like Erin said, I'm doing double duty today because I'm representing Sun Sounds of Arizona. We have our booth downstairs, but I'm also here as a member of the Arizona Friends of Talking Books. Now, Sun Sounds is the perfect partner because we both have the same mission, and that is making print material accessible to those who need it. The library focuses mainly on books. Sun Sounds, we focus on local and national newspapers and magazines. But both services rely on volunteers, and the volunteers that do the work, they are the backbone of both organizations, because without the volunteers, we could not be doing what we do. Now, with the vast array of programming that Sun Sounds broadcast, after the local news, believe it or not, the grocery ads are the most popular program. And I always say that if we ever make a mistake with the grocery ads, that's when people will call up. Now, we even have listeners who will record the grocery ads, take that recording, and then go to the grocery store because they want to make sure that they get the same deal that everybody else is getting. And I also want to tell you about what we have done that I'm very, very proud of at Sun Sounds. we have partnered with the Secretary of State's office, and we have made the voter information pamphlet accessible, and we put that into audio format. You know, that thick guide that you got in the mail that usually went off on the counter and that you had to scramble for just before you filled out your ballot to find out what you were voting for, that we put that into audio format. And for the 2024 election, we did all the ballot propositions, all the judges' information, and all the voting information. We put that into a telephone dial-in system. So somebody would call the phone number, and then they would just pick and choose what they wanted to listen to. But we even went a step further, because that wasn't enough. We put the condensed version of each ballot proposition. Remember, we had 14 of them this year. We put it into audio formats, not only in English, but we did it in Spanish, Navajo, and Hopi. And that was, and still is, available on our website. I had taken it off the website, but for today, I loaded everything back on. So if you would like to listen to some of those ballot propositions in Hopi or Navajo, be sure to go to the Sun Sounds booth. We have it pulled up on our computer, we have some headphones, and you can kind of listen, and it's really neat to listen to. And if that wasn't enough, we went another step further. We did a talk show on all the ballot propositions. What the proposition was, what a yes vote meant, and what a no vote meant. So the listener was able to ascertain all this information in easy to understand language. And we made sure we aired that several times before the election. I think we aired it about a half a dozen times. And I have to tell you, doing a talk show for an hour on 14 ballot propositions, after the last few were kind of a struggle, and you can kind of hear us fading a little bit, but we wanted to make sure that listeners were able to get the same information that people are reading and take for granted. We wanted to help listeners understand what they would be voting on. And access to voting is not a privilege, but it's a constitutional right. And we at Sun Sounds, we want to do whatever we can to make sure that people have access to voter information and the voter pamphlets. And in addition to the Secretary of State voter guides, we also worked with Clean Elections, and we did all the candidate statements, not only for the general election, but we did the primaries. And then as they changed their station, we updated them, and we did it for the primaries. And that is a separate telephone number. So we made sure that everyone had the same information, print to speech. And if you go down to our booth, you'll see Maris and Michael down there. And Maris is our outreach coordinator, and she was speaking with Colleen from Phoenix. And Colleen said, whoever put together the election guide and the telephone access is a saint. This is a wonderful thing for people who cannot see these hefty ballots with so many propositions. They all deserve awards. My husband and I are trying to understand the numerous and hefty ballot propositions, and we really appreciate your help. Thanks to you, and thanks to Sun Sounds. Now I'm going to switch hats a little bit, and I'm going to start talking about the Arizona Friends of Talking Books. It's such a great organization because they obviously share the mission of the Arizona Talking Book Library. A lot of really good people that give of their time. And they have their fundraiser, they have their wine and cheese, they have their online auction, and they put in tireless hours to raise money for the Arizona Talking Book Libraries. And all the money raised goes to support the programs, such as the popular large print catalogs. And if you go downstairs to their table, you can get one of their large print catalogs. They're sent out every year. What? Calendars. What did I say? Calendars. Oh, calendars. And they're sent out every year. The Friends group also helps to purchase audio-described movies. And again, like Linda was saying, if you have never listened to an audio-described movie, take the opportunity and do it. It's just really cool to listen to, and how they put the description in just between the dialogue seamlessly. The Friends group also supports the volunteer program, the recording studios, the summer reading program, and also special funding requests, such as the latest project, and that is where you are right now, the construction and audio system in this room. Remember, we have a table downstairs, and we urge you to stop down and learn a little bit more about us. Well, as the Talking Book Library celebrates its 55th anniversary, the Arizona Friends of Talking Books has been around for 26 of those years, raising money and supporting the endeavors of the library. We thank you very much for supporting the library and celebrating with us. If you haven't taken the tour yet, please do. There are so many nooks and crannies in this library. I don't know how anyone doesn't get lost, because I think you've lost me a couple of times. But thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrea. And so especially at this 12 o'clock hour, we have a little bit of a theme here. So we are a branch of the Arizona State Library Archives and Public Records, and that is a division of the Secretary of State. So in addition to providing audio and braille materials and different accessible materials to people across the state, we also have we value the importance of making the voting process accessible as well. So you have a kind of example of how that is achieved through Sun Sounds of Arizona and how they fit into that picture. The next speaker, last but not least today, we're very happy to welcome Scott Jarrett. Maricopa County elections, which he represents today, has been a common feature at our in-person open houses throughout the years, and we're very happy to have them back this year to talk a little bit about what your options are for voting, in Maricopa County. So Scott has been with Maricopa County elections for over 5 years now. He currently serves as the elections director, responsible for directing all in-person voting, tabulation operations, candidate filing, campaign finance, and warehouse operations. Scott has a wealth of knowledge directing the department operations and implementing strategic direction. He works closely with the Maricopa County Board of Supervisors, Maricopa County Manager, Maricopa County Recorder, and reports directly to the Maricopa County's Executive Director. Scott is also an elections task force member of the Bipartisan Policy Center, a member of the Election Assistance Commission Local Leadership Council, and serves as president of the Election Officials of Arizona. So please give a warm welcome to Scott.
Well, thank you, Erin, and I'm so thrilled to be here at the Arizona Talking Library. I'd actually never been here before, and so I was walking around and seeing some of those nooks and crannies, and just really impressed with the offering that it's provided here. It's like a little treasure or jewel here in the desert to serve our Arizona residents here. As was mentioned, I am the elections director for Maricopa County. I'm going to talk through just a little bit of things related to Maricopa County and voting in Maricopa County, and then talk through some of those options that we provide to make sure voting is accessible for all voters. So in Maricopa County, and this is similar to pretty much all the different counties in Arizona, there's 15 of them, offering elections or administering elections is a bifurcation from two different entities. One is the county-wide elected recorder, who offers mail-in voting and voter registration services, and then the Board of Supervisors, which oversees the elections department, which offers the candidate filing, the in-person voting experience, as well as then counting of those ballots. And so I oversee those hiring of all of our temporary workers. I know that we've mentioned several times individual volunteers, right? And we can't be able to administer election without our volunteers. They actually get paid because they're poll workers. Statute requires that we pay them, but for them it really is like a volunteer or a civic duty service, right? They end up doing long hours, and they really don't get paid a lot of money, but they're really the backbone. We look at our poll workers as like the face of the Maricopa County voting experience, and really when voters, when they go out to vote at the polls, the direct experience they get with those poll workers is what they take back with them, and whether they felt like they had a good experience, and even whether they may trust the results of the election. So a few other things about Maricopa County, right? We are the third largest voting jurisdiction in the entire country, right? We follow Los Angeles County, and then another county in Texas, Harris County. That's where Houston is. We sometimes go back and forth between the second largest and the third largest. Currently, Harris County edges us out just a little bit by the number of voters. We have about just over 2.6 million voters that we're serving in Maricopa County. But not only are we very large from a number of voters perspective, we're very large from a geographic perspective. So we are larger than 7 states. Now, I like to brag about that, but we have a neighbor just to the north of us, Coconino County. That's where Flagstaff is. And when I talk about how large we are from a geographic perspective, they sort of chuckle because they're double the size of us, right? And they actually have one of the best voting stories in the entire state, right? So they have to put a voting location in the bottom of the Grand Canyon, right? So they used to have to, in order to get all the voting equipment down there for election day, pack it in on mules, right? And then after election day, that next day, they'd have to then take all the ballots that were voted, all that information, and pack it out on those mules. Now they cheat a little bit because they got to have a helicopter to assist them with that. I keep asking the Board of Supervisors if I could get a helicopter too, and they said, well, if you had a Grand Canyon, maybe so. But yeah, election officials are very dedicated to serving voters and meeting them, right? Because it's their agency, being able to participate in that democratic process. A few other things with Maricopa County. I mentioned how large we are. We are right in a swing state, a very competitive state, especially when you're starting to talk about those high-profile national contests. And we're situated right in the center of that state. So what that means is we represent not only 62% of the number of voters that participate in the election. The next largest county in Arizona is Pima County, where Tucson is. They're about 15%, so much, much larger. But because we're centrally located, that means all of those voting jurisdictions and political boundaries overlap Maricopa County. So in the state of Arizona, we have 9 congressional districts. 8 of them overlap Maricopa County. We have 30 legislative districts, right? So the legislative districts, that's our state representatives, our state senators, right? 22 of those overlap Maricopa County. So a very politically dynamic county, and we're roughly about a third registered Republicans, a third registered Democrats, and a third registered independents or others. We do have a few other small parties. No Labels Party, I don't know if anyone have heard of that. That's a relatively new party. We've got our Libertarian Party, our Green Party, and we even still have some folks that register with like the Bull Moose Party and others. They end up falling into that other category on their voter registration card. But a very politically diverse. We've got over 20 different cities and towns that are in Maricopa County, 7 tribal nations that we serve as well. So just a fantastic, I'm thrilled to be a part of this county and to be part of that politically diverse county. So a few other things, right, about elections. So we do have, some people ask, well, what do you do in the off cycle, right? You only work 2 days out of the year. Last year, no. We are busy year round, every year in our even years and odd years as well. So we actually have an upcoming May jurisdictional election for the cities of Goodyear and Glendale. So that's going to be May 20th. They will still have early voting starting 27 days before that. We still have to serve our military and overseas voters. We have to have ballots prepared and ready to go out in the mail for them 45 days before the election. And then we also will have shortly, there's actually, the governor hasn't called it yet, but there's going to be a special election in Congressional District 7 that's going to be this summer. So that's going to be a primary election, and that's going to follow up with a special general election, which will be most likely in the September timeframe, then followed by our schools, right? They always need some money to support them in their operations. So then we'll have jurisdictional elections in November as well. So busy year in and out.
So, question, so you talked about some city elections. Do you guys coordinate with the cities for their own elections?
Yes, so the city clerk, for those 20 plus cities in Maricopa County, they are actually considered the officer in charge of elections, but nearly every city contracts, well, first I should say the question was, their cities and towns, and we were talking about those, do we contract or work with the cities to help administer their elections? And the answer is yes. So we have 20 plus cities and towns in Maricopa County. The city or town clerk is considered the officer in charge of elections. And in Maricopa County, then we are considered the vendor when we are offering that election for them. So through the Board of Supervisors, we approve an internal government agreement, essentially a contract that sets all the parameters around how we would administer the elections. The only city that does administer their own elections, as long as they don't coincide with the primary general, is the city of Phoenix. In Pima County, the city of Tucson does that similarly. But as I mentioned, Goodyear and Glendale are having an upcoming election here in May. They don't have any election staff, so we are their vendor, and then we will be administering that election for them.
Election staff.
So but we are very much value providing access to all voters. And there's one thing that I wanted to highlight. So our mission statement has these words in it, and the first word is providing accessible voting, right? The other is providing secure voting, providing transparent voting, being efficient in our operations, and providing reliable voting. So those aren't just words that we glance over. Those are central tenets to how we administer elections. But sometimes those words and implementing those are in conflict with each other, right? I'm going to provide a couple of examples. So when we talk about accessible, well, one way to make voting incredibly easy is, we put a voting location on every single corner, street corner, right? Well, that would be able to provide very accessible voting, make it easy for people to just walk out their house and go and be able to cast their vote at that voting location. But that would be in direct conflict with reliability, right? When you think about, I mentioned all of our poll workers, right, that we hire for election, and we have to train them. So I've heard that setting up a voting location, especially on election day, is very much like setting up a business for the very first time, right? In businesses, when they're operating, there's all these rules and regulations and forms that they have to fill up, and equipment and technology, right? So you have to train poll workers to be successful in administering that election. Well, if we had voting locations on every single corner, we would probably end up failing at making sure that every one of those voting options was available, just because we could not successfully train all of those poll workers. Very similarly, we were talking about technology earlier in this discussion, right? And technology has been able to really advance voting, making it much more accessible, right? In Maricopa County, we've gone to a vote center model, which that means that voters can vote anywhere. They're no longer assigned that one individual voting location. But the only way to do that is through technology. Well, that means that we have to train our poll workers on how to use this technology. Also, in contrast with reliability, making sure that equipment is set up. I remember when I was, before I ever thought I was going to work in elections full time as the elections director, this was back in 2010, I was an inspector at one of our voting locations. Well, I was really hired as just a clerk, and then the judge that I was hired for that voting location quit. And then the inspector, who's the supervisor of the voting location, quit. And there, lo and behold, I was then appointed as the inspector of this voting location. And I was tasked with setting up our accessible voting device. It was called our Edge device at the time. And I went to the voting location. Well, the training, right, I had taken 45 days in advance. I got there, tried to set up this. I had no clue on how to set up our accessible voting device, right? So I had to call a troubleshooter right? It took them a few hours for them to be able to show up. They got there, tried to set up the successful vote. They couldn't set it up either, right? And the equipment wasn't working. And then we had to call back, and the central facility had to then deliver us a new equipment. We finally got that set up, but it wasn't available if a voter had needed to use it for the first half of voting. So one of the things, I took this role in 2019, and we got brand new equipment. Some of the equipment that you can go see and experience back behind those areas over there. And it is so easy to set up. I remember one of the first things that, right, because you want to make it easy to use for the voter, but if it can't be set up and it's not available, then what use is it, right? So I went through and I asked, when we got it, I wanted to try to set up our accessible voting without any instructions, right? I'm not a very tech savvy guy, right? So I walked up, they said, okay, here's all the equipment, here's the printer that goes along with it, the touch screen, and I was able to do it without any instructions. So since 2019, we've been able to have every one of our accessible voting devices in our voting locations available and set up. We'll say we're not perfect every once in a while, right? One of them might run out of toner, other types of things, but then that's why we have then a very robust troubleshooting staff that then can go out there and get those items resolved and up and running fairly quickly. So when we talk about options for voters to be able to vote, one of those is at our in-person voting, right? So we want to make sure that that can serve every single voter that may show up. So I already talked about vote centers. You're always in the right location. You're never out or in the wrong location and would be forced to vote a provisional ballot that wouldn't count. But now you're in the right location. We go and do a ADA compliance inspection. So we make sure, right, that it's easy to get access to that voting location, right? That we've got the ramps there if someone would need to, right, and can't use those stairs and those steps to get into the voting location. We check the door handles to make sure that they're not those round door handles, right, that they've got the lever. If they don't, we've got attachments that we can add to them, right? We make sure that we've got accessible parking close by the entrances at every one of those voting locations. Make sure that the parking lots are well lit, right? Those are the types of steps that we're doing to make sure that our voting locations are accessible. I mentioned our accessible voting device itself, right? That has an audio tactical device, right? It looks like a Xbox controller, right? And that's really easy to use. It even has an attachment for a sip puff device, right? You can, on the touch screen itself, right, the contrast, you can change it from being the color screen to being black being the predominant color to the white being the predominant color, so you have that good contrast. It's got the audio. So we were talking earlier about the going through and putting that publicity pamphlet or voter guide, and I sympathize with you very much for how long that was, right? Maricopa County, for our general, we had 2-page ballot, the 14 statewide measures. We also had then the county measures that were on top of that, one of the longest ballots in Maricopa County's history. But we have to go through and make sure that we have a consistent phonetic pronunciation of that name on our ballot. So if someone went to use that accessible voting device, they'd be able to hear that. And no matter what county, whether you're in Greenlee County, in La Paz County, Yuma County, Coconino County, Navajo County, that they're pronounced exactly the same way. So you're not providing an advantage to one candidate or the other. So the Secretary of State puts out these guides that we all use as the county, and I will say the software that we use to take a written word, right? You all have probably experienced that as you're going through and putting books on tape, but if you're using the software program to do that, sometimes it's not straightforward. Sometimes you have to add extra spaces in there, double N's, or letters that you don't even know why that you would need to have those letters so that you can get that name pronounced the correct way. So, but one of those, that is our accessible voting device. But we also provide accessible options through the mail, or, right, so through the mail, you can request a Braille ballot. We are one of the only counties in Arizona that have our own embosser that can produce that Braille ballot, but we've partnered with all 14 other counties that if they send us their ballot language, we would create that Braille ballot for them, mail it back to that recorder so then they can deliver that Braille ballot through the mail to that voter. We also have large print ballots. I'm a fairly short guy, so if I had a large print ballot with us, it'd probably pretty much cover my whole body here, and you wouldn't be able to see me. Yeah. So large print ballots, we keep a record of who's requested them in the past. So once they've requested it, we'll automatically send a large print ballot out to them for every single election. Same with a Braille ballot. But we also offer a service, and this is through the Maricopa County Recorder's Office, a special election board. So these are bipartisan teams, Republicans and Democrats. We partner with the political parties themselves to have appointees into these roles, and they'll go visit nursing homes, assisted living homes, or for voters at their home themselves. If they need assistance in being able to complete that ballot, so you have that bipartisan representation, they can go out there. As long as you've made that request 7 days before Election Day, we will honor that request and make sure that we have a special election board go out there and be able to serve those voters. So right back to that accessibility in our mission statement, trying to make sure that we're serving all those voters and making sure that we're providing those options for every voter to have that agency, to be able to participate. Like one of the things we get asked, do they still have the same privacy, right, that other voters would have when they're participating in the electoral process? So at our voting locations themselves, that accessible voting device, it's designed for them to be able to vote that ballot on their own, right? That's why we have that option with the audio through the accessible voting device, or the contrast changing within. But we also train our poll workers on they can provide assistance to the voter as well, or even they don't have to leave their car. So one of the things that we offer in Maricopa County is curbside voting. So if a voter comes up to a voting location, we put these little signs, they have a little doorbell on it, but there's also a phone number. They can call our hotline, then we'll call the inspector at the voting location. They can send out a bipartisan team out to serve that voter, assist that voter. They'll have to get the ID for that voter, check them in, take it into our check-in station, print that voter's individual ballot, bring it back out to the voter. That goes into a privacy envelope, so then the poll workers don't see how that voter voted. Then they take that in and insert it into the tabulator. So a voter being able to vote that ballot on that accessible voting device by themselves does allow for them to have that privacy, just like any other voter.
Is there any way that you could get the maybe software for those accessible voting things to people's homes so they could do it? Because my biggest problem with the ballot is filling in the dot. I can't see the dot, and it just goes everywhere. I mean, I can't fill the circle.
So one of the question was, is there a way to get the software, the technology right into the home of the voter? And we're actually currently testing out in Maricopa County right now with our military and overseas voters, right? So the same technology that our accessible voting device has for someone if they went to vote in person, for a military and overseas voter to be able to vote that ballot remotely overseas to complete that out. So I do believe, right, at sometime in the future that will be available for voters here as well, but currently we don't have that option available.
Do you ever think about getting like a pen that has like a little ink dot that you can just fill that circle in with?
So the question was about the pen that to fill in the oval, because one of the things are, right, when you're filling in that oval, and especially if it's a very long ballot, how long that takes to fill it in. So in the voting location itself, we have to really test our pens, because the tabulators themselves, when you're inserting that ballot into that tabulator, there's this really thin mylar that as the ballot's running over that, the pen and the ink could smudge onto that. And then that could cause the tabulator to be then either reject the ballot, and then it has to then go into another bin and come back to our central count facility to be tabulated or duplicated. So we want them to use a very specific ink that dries and adheres to the ballot quickly so it doesn't cause that smudging on the tabulators. So, but at home, for sure, things that people could fill out their ballot easier, we encourage that. So that is my presentation, and I'm really thrilled that you all invited me, that I was able to convey some of the options that voters have to participate.
So I just want to thank everybody today. I looked at the time just now and it's 1 o'clock, so we're just kind of winding down here at the, again, first in-person event for the library for the open house since 2017. So, you know, in a sense here, you're all here together celebrating a birthday because on March 19th, the library in Arizona will have been serving Arizona patrons directly within our borders for now 55 years. So thank you everybody for joining us today. You know, thank you all of our speakers today, but Scott was mentioning if you haven't been there just yet, before they start closing up shop there, just behind us is where Maricopa County Elections has set up some of the things that he was describing. So if you want to get to experience that before you leave today, that would be my recommendation for your next stop, as it's just around the corner, essentially, just behind us. Beyond that, we do still have on the other side, closer to the elevators in this room, the device advice booth set up. So, and there, our representative from the National Library Service, Kevin Osborne. This is our first experience seeing the machine as well. So before you leave today, definitely see what's next coming out, rolling out over the next few years, most likely for the digital talking machine player for the audiobooks we provide. So. And also, thank you to anyone who is joining us today online or after the fact. I imagine, Scott, that a lot of what you described, especially since you're partnering with the other counties, anyone who's listening in from another county in Arizona also has access to accessible voting equipment on voting day and ballots as well. So that's correct. So thank you all again, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your stay with us. And if you're ready to head out now, there is an aisle just to your right over here that will take you back to our elevators. Before you go for the day, be sure to say hello to our exhibitors downstairs as well. And just kind of going back in time, Andrea's group, Sun Sounds of Arizona, should still be down there before they start taking all the stuff off the booth. So thank you so much, and you have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.